Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Mesechet Peah. We're up to Perek Bet Mishnah Daled. Yesterday we spoke about different separators, that even if you have one field, but if you have this separator in between them, it makes it considered two fields. And thereby you have to give two corners, two separate corners. We spoke about regarding trees, even if trees are planted at a distance from each other, for example, you have one apple tree here, and many feet later you have another apple tree, that's not considered a separation because trees, since they take up a lot of space, they're generally put widened from each other. However, the Mishnah said, in order to make a separation, you need to have a wall 10 tefachim high. If you have a wall between the two trees that is 10 tefachim high, it separates the trees to be considered part of two separate fields. The Mishnah now in Mishnah Dala discusses carob trees. That carob trees, even with the wall in between, will still be considered one field so long they could see each other. Let's see the Mishnah. In the case of carob trees, as long as the trees can see each other, which means the Rav explains, I'm standing by one tree, and even with the wall I could see the other carob tree, that's going to make it considered like one field. Even if the branches on top are not intertwined, like we said in the previous Mishnah. We spoke about if you have two apple trees and a wall in between, 10 tefachim high, right? It makes it considered like two separate fields. But if the apple tree's branches are both intertwined with each other, it makes it considered like one field. By the case of carobs, even if the branches aren't intertwined with each other and there's a wall in between, so long as you could see the other tree when you're standing next to one of them, it's considered one field. Why? The Mefarshim explain carob trees are very different because they're very tall and the branches are very extensive, very wide. Therefore, they were always separated very far from each other in wide spaces. So putting a wall doesn't make it separate fields unless you cannot see it. Once you cannot see the other tree anymore when you're standing by one of them, and you have the wall, that makes it already a separate field. Now, Rabban Gamliel speaks about a tree that's even harder to separate than carobs. Amar Rabban Gamliel said, Noagin ayu bet Abba, it was the custom in my father's house, Notnin peah achad lezetim shiu lahem b'chol ruach. They gave a single peah for all the olive trees that they owned on each side of the city, which the Rav explains. On the east side of the city, you have 5 trees, but they're on the east side of the city. They're all scattered out. That's considered one field. On the north, you have 5 trees. That's one field. On the south, you have 5 trees. That's one field. On the west, you have 5 trees. That's another field, right? Even though on one of the sides, let's say, for example, on the east, you have 5 trees and they're not next to each other. They're very far. They're still considered as one field, even when we all separated them, even if you can't see them, since they're all on the same side. Now, I believe the Derech Emunah, I believe it's Reb Chaim Kanievsky, Maran Torah Shlita. I believe that is his sefer, Derech Emunah. He suggests, based on Yerushalmi, why if they're all on one side of the city, that makes it one field? They can't see each other. There's a wall between them. Why would it make it considered one field? He explains, based on Yerushalmi, that the custom, that it was common to have a single olive press on each side of the city to process all the trees on that side. So the east side of the city had 100 olive trees, right? And they're all scattered throughout the east side. They would have one olive press to handle all those trees. Therefore, he says that the olive press was the common feature that would unite all those trees, making it to be considered like one field. That's how I believe the Derech Emunah, which is Reb Chaim Kanievsky Shlita, explains it in the name of the Yerushalmi, based on the Yerushalmi. Now, V'lecharuvin kol haru'in ze et ze. In the case of the carob trees, as long as they could see one another, like the Tana said. Rabban Gamliel says in his father's house, they would consider all the olive trees on one side of the city to be considered one field. And regarding the carobs, it's like the case, in the case of the carob trees, as long as they could see one another, they're not considered separate, just like the Tana Kama, even if there's a wall, as long as you could see one another. Now, a different opinion regarding what Rabban Gamliel's custom in his father's house was. There's a discrepancy. Rabbi Eliezer beRabbi Tzadok Omer Mishmo. Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Rabbi Tzadok, says in Rabban Gamliel's name, Af lecharuvin shiu lahem b'chol ha'ir. They gave one peah even for carob trees that they had around the entire city. So you had one tree in the north, one tree in the south, one tree in the east, one tree in the west. They would give all considered as one field. Why? According to Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Rabbi Tzadok, Rabban Gamliel held carob trees are much more difficult to separate than olive trees. The Rav writes, "Ve'en halacha Rabbi Eliezer b'Rabbi Tzadok she'amar mishmo, aval halacha Rabban Gamliel." Rabbi Eliezer b'Rabbi Tzadok, the halacha does not follow him. He holds that carob trees are harder to separate than olive trees, whereas the first Tana said that Rabban Gamliel holds carob trees are easier to separate. That is the end, Rabotai, of Mishnah Daled. Now, Rabotai, let's continue with Mishnah Hey. The Mishnah discusses now other factors when deciding if one field is considered like two fields regarding the halacha Peah. Hazoret tzadeo min echad. Somebody plants in his field one species of produce. Even if he harvests in two separate harvestings, it's still considered like one field to give one peah. Meaning, the Mefarshim explain, after a field is reaped and the produce is processed, it is heaped into one large pile on the threshing floor, right? You pile it on. Therefore, each gathering is called a threshing floor. So in this case, the farmer reaped and processed one pile, and then he went back in one half of the field, and then he went back into the second half of the field. So even though he made two separate threshing floors, two separate piles, not consecutively, he did one side and then he did another side. He didn't do it in one shot. No, then peah achad, he gives one corner because the entire field was planted with a single species. So it makes no difference how many parts you process separately. It's one field, one species. But if you planted the field with two species of produce, two separate types, so now even if you gather all the crop in one shot, pile it all together, you would leave two peahs, because again, each species is considered to be growing in its own field, and you cannot leave one peah for one field that has different produce growing in it. You'd have to leave both produce have their own peah. You cannot leave one peah for produce in one field of produce that grows in another. The Mishnah continues. Right, we said even if you gather into one crop, you give two separate peot because it's two separate species. The Mishnah gives a case when it does make a difference whether you. Right now, we said it doesn't make a difference how you harvest it. The Mishnah now is going to give a case where it does make a difference. If someone plants his field with two different types of wheat, for example, brown wheat and white wheat, right? It's an example. It's the same thing if you plant any other variety of other species. If you gather both of them in a single crop, they're considered now same part of one field, and you give one peah. But if you gather the white wheat as one crop and the brown wheat as another crop, you give two separate peot. Right? You have to give each separately. Why? Because now they're considered separate fields, and when you make it two separate fields, it's going to be required to give two separate peot. And the next Mishnah is going to explain why it makes a difference by wheat and barley, by this white wheat and brown wheat, that if you harvest it all together, it's one peah, and if you harvest them separately, it's two different peot. That is the end of today's Mishnah. Amen.